Welcome to this interactive panel discussion and video screening on the ethics of community, solidarity and care. And this is part of the IR and ethics themed contribution to the School of Security Studies Research Conference on Global Shocks. In addition to this panel, we are also publishing a blog series on the same theme on the RCIR blog, and we'll give you a link to that later on. My name is Leonie Ansems de Vries, and I work at the Department of War Studies. And one of my roles is leading the research theme for international relations and ethics. So I'll co-chair this session today, together with Maria Jellinek, who's the PhD rep for the theme, and who will introduce herself after the video screening. And I'll start with a few housekeeping notes. So we are live streaming this via YouTube. And there will be, I'll speak about this later, there will be a Q&A afterwards, so but you can already ask questions anytime through the Q&A button, and then we'll answer them later on. And we also encourage you to join us via Twitter, and you can do so via the hashtag Global Shocks. Now, why have we chosen to focus on the ethics of solidarity, community and care? Global shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic highlight the structural, political, economic, social and historical inequalities that put some people more at risk than others. And this raises important questions around solidarity, community and care. And I'll speak about this later on in the video as well. But I think at the same time, it's not just at the moment the COVID-19 pandemic, there is an awful lot going on, including also recent events in the US with the murder of yet another Black person by the police. But we can see such death through other forms of violence as well, including the violence of neglect. But we've also seen the renewance and emergence of community solidarity and care in recent months. So in this panel, we will reflect on these questions in a somewhat unconventional way. As we were organising our contribution for the conference during the COVID-19 lockdown, we wanted to encourage as many colleagues to be able to take part in some way. And we felt that a traditional panel discussion wouldn't be the best way to do so. So we were trying to think more creatively. And we asked our theme members to suggest their own contributions for the blog or otherwise, but also to send us a 30-second video in which they reflect on what the ethics of solidarity, community and care means to them, or how this features in their research. And we were very happy to receive 12 very thoughtful videos from a range of colleagues, from PhD students to professors, and offering very diverse reflections on this theme. So the contributions raise questions around injustice and inequality, offer example of community action, and reflect on how communities can be caringly fostered as well as violently imposed. They offer conceptions of solidarity in terms of responsibility, as a virtue, as an act of resistance, as well as a policing mechanism. They speak of unity and struggle and violent and interconnected worlds. The school comms team, and especially Aisha Khan and Lizzie Ellen, have done a fantastic job fitting these 30-second videos of our colleagues together into this larger video, which we will screen in a moment. And after the screening, we'll invite 3 of the video contributors. So we have Mervyn Frost and Dushi Pillai and Pablo de Orellana to briefly reflect and expand on their contribution. And after that, we'll encourage all of you to ask questions and to get engaged in a more informal discussion. And this is where if you ask a question via the Q&A, this is where we will answer these as well. So we can now watch the video.
how to structure our societies. I have grave doubts about this and would really like to discuss it further.
For me, an ethics of care and an ethics of solidarity are core philosophies underpinning my research. We live in a violent world, one that is still shaped by the legacies of colonialism. To understand violence and power today, we need to place the connections between colonialism and contemporary structures of oppression at the front and centre of our analysis. In a world such as this, care and solidarity are acts of political resistance.
To me, solidarity, community, and care are about responsibility. They mean asking who are we responsible to when we do research, and in the academy more broadly. For me, it is recognising my responsibility towards those who contribute to my research, trying to always be aware of my positionality and our relationship. Within the institution too, it is about recognising that staff and students, we are all interconnected and interdependent.
I've been in Madrid in recent months, where solidarity meant staying at home to counteract the virus and for the sake of the health workers who we applauded every night. At the same time, though, over 8,000 people have been arrested in Spain for breaking the lockdown, and the government, in fact, has said that this is what happens to insolidarios, to those who lack solidarity. So we've seen, on one hand, the beauty of solidarity being expressed freely, but on the other hand, we've also seen the potential for abuse when a certain idea of solidarity is enforced by the state.
My research looks at the link between education and conflict in Sri Lanka and how transitional justice could leverage education to build positive peace. To me, this speaks to the idea of ethics of community because schools play a really important role in setting the moral standards and ideals of a community, both locally and at a larger imagined community, a nation.
So my research focuses on the relationship between archives and the formation and governance of communities. And this is both about how archival power, perhaps in the more traditional mode of archiving, often works to restrict, homogenize and constrain the imaginaries of community, but also how perhaps using more creative modes of archiving, particularly things like the arts, we might think about how difference and different voices and different ways of speaking can become the center point around which communities are formed.
One of the questions provoked by my research on Sufi communities is the ethics of virtue and being of service to your surrounding community. My PhD explores the lived realities of how Sufis develop socially harmonious communities in their surroundings. I observed their ethos of service to the community, as well as their understanding and practice with regards to a balanced ethos, unity, and equality. I explored this through vignettes and examples found in 2 field research sites in 2019 when I observed and held interviews with my research participants. One, Mtio Shah Mahsudi, a Sufi order in Düsseldorf, Germany, and the second, the Al-Harakiyya order, a Sunni Sufi group in Casablanca, Morocco.
In my research, I examined how the doctrine on humanitarian intervention can coexist alongside a broad prohibition on the use of force in the United Nations Charter. As the contemporary legal framework regulating the use of force is in detriment, interventions that lack Security Council authorizations tend to be justified on the basis of virtues such as solidarity. But while these virtues have a high intuitive appeal, a military intervention justified on the basis of them isn't necessarily a wise course of action. My project drew on the deeper ethical values that are internal to the practice of international law and provide guidance on how to regulate a legal right to intervention to limit the use of reckless military force in global politics.
My own commitment to ethics of solidarity, care, and community come from my feminist praxis. Indeed, I'm inspired by so many feminists who've come before me, including but not limited to Cynthia Enloe, Anna Agatha Angelou, Lily Ling, and Teresa Tioa. What these feminists have shown us is that it is possible to build worlds in which multiple voices, experiences, and perspectives are brought into vibrant exchange and not washed over for the power of a single story, but rather it's through this vibrant exchange that we do build stronger, more ethical communities and solidarity of care across difference.
In my research, solidarity refers to the question of whether in activist movements there can be transnational solidarity between civilians and the diaspora community.
So in my research, I look at the relationship between spokespersons and the spoken for, and how the speech of spokespersons on behalf of a social group, or for example, a cause, actually produces communities or even violently imposes them. And there's a kind of relationship between the spokespersons and the spoken for going on of mutual authorization and legitimization. And it manifests itself in many different practices, of which actually care and solidarity can be one of those. And I find them in many unexpected places in my research. For example, Russian military courts, where Crimean Tatar men have been tried on terrorism charges since the annexation of Crimea. And this is actually one of the examples I explore in our blog post.
Solidarity and community are vital aspects of nationalist thought. And in this coronavirus crisis, this has become particularly evident because they believe in unequal access to solidarity and community on the basis of your birth, which determines which culture you may participate in, and therefore whether you have the right or not by birth to access solidarity and community. They believe that international relations and indeed society are a struggle for survival, which is why they have refused to collaborate in EU and WHO collective efforts to address the coronavirus crisis, and are indeed, even within the nation, happy to let the weakest die.
Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed watching this fantastic video screening featuring some of our colleagues here in the IR and ethics research team at the Department of War Studies. My name is Jellinek and I'm a PhD candidate here at the department, and I will be co-chairing the panel together with Leonie. As Leonie already mentioned, we are very pleased that 3 of the contributors to this video are here with us today as panelists. And the purpose of this virtual panel is to have an interactive discussion, so we're hoping that you're all eager to engage. But before opening for discussion, we're going to give Mervin, Dushi, and Pablo 3 to 4 minutes each to reflect a bit more in depth over their respective contributions. Mervin, why don't you go ahead and start?
Thank you very much, Maria, for that introduction. I apologize for the lack of sound in the first part of the video, but I hope you have caught the gist through the text that was shown at the bottom. Now, I want to stress that this crisis we face is a global crisis, and it's a global crisis with 2 features. The one is, of course, the healthcare crisis, this awful pandemic. And then the second crisis caused by the first one is a global economic one, which threatens, we still haven't seen the worst of it, threatens a depression, a recession, and in particular, the worst off countries in the world are going to find life very difficult. Now, what I want to highlight in this short talk of mine is that this pandemic brought forth from all sides huge expressions of solidarity, community, and care. As I mentioned in the video, I myself was a victim of the COVID-19, and I was absolutely bowled over by the care that was offered me. However, I'm gravely concerned about the future because what this pandemic has revealed is that there are causes for what happened, and that some of the causes have to do with inequalities around the world. And as we move beyond the pandemic and some kind of normality arises, we're going to have to think about how to reform our institutions, our international institutions, and how to rearrange things. And I'm very skeptical about the principle of solidarity, community, and care being the relevant values to guide us in reforming and in reforming the global institutions. And my reason for saying that is these 3 terms apply to every social formation that one might think of. So if you're a member of a family, you would commit to solidarity, community, and care. If you're a member of a nation, your nation would no doubt commit to that, and so on through every form of society, or every form of social organization. So in other words, they don't give us guidance, these 3 terms, about how to arrange our affairs internationally. And I think that when we get to considering how to rearrange things to avoid this happening again, we're going to have to consider the principles of justice. Who gets what, when, and how? And the notion of community, solidarity, and care doesn't really guide us there when we're considering that question. So that's where I want to end my session.
Thanks, Mervyn. Hello, everyone. My name is Dushi Pillai, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of War Studies. I was saying a little bit on my personal experience of the lockdown, and then moving on to Sri Lanka, which is the focus of my research. Personal experience has been increased sense of solidarity in my community. There's a WhatsApp group for my whole street, so I know my way I've never imagined I ever would, including what they eat, what time they wake up, and what they think is funny. And the birthday party cancel suddenly resulted in lots of people standing outside singing happy birthday very loudly. But I also acknowledge that this is a very privileged experience and is not something shared by everyone, even in this country, let alone in some parts of the world where there's extreme inequality and poor governance. So I want to talk a little bit about Sri Lanka and how the unequal way the pandemic responses has affected minority communities in Sri Lanka, particularly the Muslim and the Tamil communities. So the Sri Lankan government has effectively suspended the parliament and the judiciary and has started a very militarized and oppressive response to the pandemic. The country is virtually run by the executive with no scrutiny or any checks. And one of the things that's happened during the pandemic is pardoning of a war criminal, a military personnel who's been prosecuted for killing 8 civilians during the civil war, which went on for 27 years in Sri Lanka. This is one of the few instances of justice where a military personnel was actually prosecuted for killing, as I said, 8 civilians, 3 of whom were children. The youngest was 5 years old, and this child showed signs of abuse and torture. And it's done in a way where there's no way for people to peacefully assemble and protest. The courts are not open for petition. The media is already self-censoring, and social media activists are often arrested if they criticize how the pandemic response is being used to carry out certain things without scrutiny. The pandemic response itself is led by a general, not a medical professional. So you can see how the militarization of the country is slowly creeping in, and the powers are being usurped by the government. And the unequal way the pandemic is being experienced is by who's allowed to remember and what. So recently we had the end of Civil War anniversary, where the Tamil communities were not allowed to gather, even observing social distancing, to remember their dead, whereas the other community in Colombo is allowed to gather and remember their war heroes, the fallen soldiers. This has further led the Tamil community to feel that there isn't a solidarity or care from the government, and that this pandemic is being used to further marginalize and abuse their rights. The other community which has also felt the pandemic in an unequal way is the Muslim community. They've already been targeted with wide hate speech across social media. And there's been a lot of retribution towards Muslim communities with regards to the business they run and the way they're sort of treated by the other communities. And one of the laws that have been introduced by the Sri Lankan government is that it becomes compulsory to cremate the dead, which is against the religious law of Muslim communities. And this is not only increasing the pain felt by the community by losing their loved ones, but also a violation of their religious rights. So this pandemic has really increased their frustrations and fear towards the government and the way it's treating its community, and has been a serious setback for the peace building and reconciliation in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you, even at a distance from my study. I've been looking at nationalism, the growth of nationalism as a phenomenon, and particularly I've been looking at the ideas that underpin the nationalist movements that have taken over so many countries in the last 5 years, from India to particularly the United States, France, Italy, and Britain. And I've been looking particularly at the phenomenon of a type of nationalists that call themselves the new right. There are many types of nationalists, and it's to be said. Nationalism is, I've been looking particularly at and nationalism, sorry, the little glitch there, nationalism can live under any umbrellas. Remember that Stalin was a socialist nationalist, and of course you can have right-wing nationalists. I've been looking at the new right nationalists, Trump, Johnson, and people like that. And from this research perspective, the issue of ethics and solidarity looks very different, because from a research perspective, the division of solidarity, who has the right to solidarity, who can access solidarity, is the key issue and is indeed the key political meeting point and struggle point. A lot of the response of nationalist leaders to the crisis has been about dividing solidarity by identity. Yeah, this is particularly visible in India or in the United States. And we see an identitarian response to a crisis that does not see identity the way I see it. The disease does not attack by ethnic group. So we have Trump and others blaming only China, the China virus, refusal to collaborate in vaccines or with the WHO or with the EU in the case of Britain. The total failure we saw yesterday of the G20 to reach any agreement, unlike 2008, to have to address what Mervyn said is the coming economic crisis after this pandemic. And also there is an interesting sense of a certain willingness to lose part of the population. And I think this has been particularly visible in the debates around the ends of lockdown. Although there's a lot of people seem to claim that this is about economic versus lives, it might well be, the way I see it from a nationalist perspective, more due to an idea that death is a natural part of human life, the way they see it, and particularly struggle amongst identities. Yeah, let me show you something. So this is a meme from a paper of mine, and a meme I took from Milo's old blog. And as you can see, it's very much about identitarian struggle, identitarian survival. We deserve, in this case, this meme is very much about we deserve to have conquered the US and keep it because our race was superior. We were stronger, more resilient, survived diseases. In the same way, surviving COVID is both a test of the power of identity and at the same time, a site, shall we say, an instance where identity distributes who has access to what. We can also see this now as we draw down out of lockdown in quarantines. Quarantines in the case of Britain and France would be almost entirely useless because without a proper track and trace, they will not work. But it's very much about passing on the buck onto an identity. The buck for the disease. We have more cases in Britain than anywhere else in Europe. We are the danger to everyone else. The quarantine is very much about discursively placing the blame somewhere else. Now, the core logic for this comes from the late 19th century and has developed since. Myself and Dr. Nicholas Mickelson, who have been doing this research for the last 3 years, we call it birth culture. It's the core concept at the heart that defines identity and politics for the new right. Now, birth culture presupposes that one has to be born into a culture in order to participate in it. And one can only participate in the cultures that are close to one's birth. Yeah, so you have to be born white in order to participate in European cultures, for instance. And if you have a different birth, your biology prevents you from being able to participate in the culture. Now, the key corollary of this is that your biology prevents you from participating in other cultures because biology and cultures are destined to struggle for survival against one another. This assumption is what drives, for instance, Trump's response to the Floyd killings. And this is very important because this is very much telling his base which identity he has picked. Crucially, patriotism becomes reduced to a divisive idea of nationalism, just one ethnic group and so on and so forth. And finally, in this, what I think is actually quite an apocalyptic political reading of this crisis, I think the most catastrophic aspect of this crisis will actually be the total collapse of large-scale political solidarity driven by identitarian politics. I think survival from this disease is being framed to be one that works on the basis of birth, one that questions access to solidarity, access to community. And herein emerges a very difficult question that I would like to pose to everyone, to my co-panelists, but perhaps also to the public to reflect with us today, is the nationalists make the claim that all societal solidarity, from solidarity during the coronavirus crisis, but also welfare, healthcare, and so on and so forth, other forms of social solidarity, including access to the country, should be limited by birth culture. Now, what should be the limits of any state solidarity? If nationalists want to use the state to distribute solidarity and all the goodies of the country only to one birth culture, fine, that's their perspective. But the rest of us should, I think, ponder the question, because it is valid, of what are the limits of this solidarity, particularly because we're looking at a very difficult next few years. It's going to be a complex economic outlook. It's going to be a difficult drawdown from this disease that will not be as simple as I think there have been the expectations of. For instance, our own sector will be terribly disrupted. What should be, if any, the limits to this solidarity? What are the limits of community at a time when the entire community becomes needy in a moment such as this? So I think I'll pass you back to Maria and Leonie to continue from here, and perhaps we can address this in questions.
Great, thank you so much, Pablo, and also to Dushi and Mervyn for very thought-provoking contributions. And I see we already have a question on the Q&A, but anyone else who wants to engage, please do so. Pop your question on the Q&A. I'll start with a question that's already been asked, and both Mervyn and Pablo have also actually asked questions in their own contribution. So we'll go on to those questions after that, and we'll keep an eye on the Q&A as well. Right, so here's a question from, it says, to Sando, that's the name that I get here. How does the panel look at turning the question of solidarity and care on its head? The groups that we may feel contribute to anti-solidarity, i.e. Or e.g. nationalist groups, may indeed feel very communal and caring internally towards its members. And I think this is something that Pablo addressed as well. How do we include the antisocial and avoid allowing them to see themselves as segregated? Do our protests achieve that, or the opposite? So I think to some extent this does speak to what Pablo said, but perhaps we can invite first Mervyn and Dushi to respond to that.
Thank you. That is indeed a very thought-provoking question, and I would see that question as in a way sympathetic to what I had to say. And I think the straightforward answer to that is we always have nationalist groups or religious fundamentalist groups, all sorts of tight-knit communities that claim that theirs is the community to which solidarity and community and care is the community within which these things should take place. Now, the antidote that has developed and has proved very, very successful worldwide is the arrival of the notion of human rights. So the human rights practice as it has developed in the world and has been endorsed by the United Nations and many, many constitutions around the world, and which is implicit, of course, in the free market system itself. The idea of human rights says that we're perfectly free to enjoy the solidarities of our immediate community, of our birth community, provided that we accord a similar kind of freedom to people born in other communities. So the whole human rights tradition is wanting us to find a way of allowing us to both be loyal to our communities and yet fair to other communities. So I think the human rights practice is the right answer to Asando.
Great, thank you, Mervyn. Dushi, did you want to respond to that as well?
Yes, thanks for the question. I mean, I think it's really interesting that we even need to think about the sort of limits of solidarity, that somehow we can kind of draw artificial boundaries around certain groups within human race and say, okay, we can just kind of have the solidarity here in this box, and then someone else has the solidarity there in a different box, when we all know that increasingly we're so interconnected that it's impossible to kind of put up these sort of very artificial boundaries. And be it climate change or the pandemic, I think we are in a world where we can't afford to draw up the bridge and say, no, we're going to deal with this by ourselves. It does require a much more connected and coherent and harmonious response to overcome this, I think. So I think, what Mehmet said with regards to human rights gives us a very clear sort of foundation and basis for building the solidarity of what's acceptable, what's included, what's not acceptable, and what should be excluded. And I think we do need to start working from this as a human race rather than as a particular birthright culture or a nationalist.
Great. Well, that links nicely to Pablo. I think you're muted.
I'm sorry to bring the pessimist note here, and I feel like I have to, because yes, finding our shared humanity is exactly the shall we say, in terms of political theory and mechanics, is the way out of this. The problem is that the new right and its allies from Modi to Bolsonaro and others don't believe there is a shared humanity. We are all races struggling for survival against one another. And this is very important, because just like the question said, this is not an assumption of hatred. Identitarian hatred is very important. Yeah, these communities, the new right communities, do have a lot of solidarity within themselves. The reason they don't extend that solidarity to anyone that is not born of the right birth culture is because they assume that other birth cultures will struggle against them. If I welcome someone of a different birth culture here in my study, they will struggle for this space with me, Lebensraum and all that. Yeah, there is a cousin of those ideas, because they both come from ethno-geopolitics of the 19th century. So yes, finding our shared humanity will definitely be a paradigm out of this, except that there is, as the key author of the new right, is a French philosopher called de Benoist, wrote in possibly the most important text for nationalists today. It's called the Manifesto of the New Right for the year 2000. One of the most important lines, if you had to reduce it to one, is there is no such thing as humanity. Our participation of social groups is mediated by our biological reality. Boom. The idea of humanity disappears. The entire paradigm of building solidarity, political action, structures on the basis of our shared humanity, our similar bodies, becomes an impossibility on the basis of this fake science of struggling against one another. And there is another important normative dimension to this fake science. This fake science does not imply, for instance, Trump, that Latinos hate Americans and want to destroy them. No, it's not personal. They're just designed to do so. Yeah, they're designed to sabotage the societies they fit in. And if you think this is an extreme idea from the alt-right, you should read Michael Gove's book, Celsius 7.7, where he too says Islamic communities are designed to subvert Christian communities they're in, unless we force them to change. Yeah, these assumptions are there. What other paradigms can we look at? I think the human one is essentially, every time we claim the human paradigm as an alternative to the nationalist birth culture paradigm, they see themselves as validated. You want to give all of our solidarity away to others. Birth identity is clearly a problem here. I think that perhaps a more nuanced version, a more practical version of a human paradigm, that is citizenship participation, the Machiavelli, the Roman and the Florentine model of participation as a way of fitting into the normative ethics of solidarity, earning, shall we say, that role, will play a role in, shall we say, rediscovering some of our shared humanity.
Great, thank you very much. It's really interesting how often we return to ideas of the human and so on, although even though that is actually quite a concept with a very particular kind of history grounded in inequalities as well. So I think we need to think about that as well. But I'm going to pass on to Maria for the next question, and then I'll come back answering some questions from the Q&A as well. So yeah, keep writing down those questions in the Q&A as well.
Thank you. We have another question here. When considering global reforms to improve our global ability to deal with pandemics, how useful as guiding principles are solidarity, community, and care? Mervyn, would you like to go ahead and start reflecting?
Happy to do that. I'm, as it were, repeating myself, but so consider here in the United Kingdom, when we consider the pandemic, what's emerging now is a grassroots feeling that certain communities, certain sectors of the British population have been worse hit than other sectors. And as things stand at the moment, it looks as if it's our Black British citizens are suffering more than the others. Now, when we start looking at the reasons for that, I can imagine a whole host of reasons will appear when inquiries start. One of them might be to do with poverty or lack of education or lack of services in certain areas, all sorts of what might be claimed as discriminations. So in order to remedy that, we would have to start thinking, what would a more just society be? And once you're thinking about justice, it seems to me you don't get very far by simply saying a just society would be a caring society. Well, we would like it to be, but it doesn't answer what form of distribution would be a caring distribution. Is a capitalist system, for example, can one reconcile capitalism with caring? Or are those mutually incompatible? So you need other principles like principles of liberty, equality, and so on. So I'm simply making a bid for the claim that caring, community, and solidarity don't guide us when thinking about how to reconstruct our society.
Thank you. Pablo and Dushi, did you have any thoughts on this, additional thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, thank you. I think I was just going to say, at least from what I can observe at the local level, it's been interesting in that I think the pandemic has brought about a more acute sense of community, certainly at the local level. And maybe it has awakened the sort of community's consciousness of its connectedness. Even though we're all vulnerable to this pandemic, I know it's very unequal, even probably on my street, but there is more awareness around that inequality that perhaps wasn't there before. And I think that could be a start of something. That's all I'm going to say.
So the question I'm addressing is examples of treatment being provided by nationality, I presume you mean, and rational healthcare by age. There are few examples of specific COVID treatment being rationed by nationality because most countries ration healthcare by nationality to start with, if that makes sense. That's why the citizenship process in India was so very important, because that's about rationing access to everything, access to the country, yeah, by birth, by, in that case, an ethnicity that is based on a confessional idea, a religious idea. In the NHS, for instance, you can no longer access NHS services if you're an overseas citizen that has not paid the health surcharge, no matter, is it kind of the health tourism surcharge for the NHS. In France, you need to have a carte verte to access any state medical services. And you can only have that if you're a legal resident. So again, healthcare has been rationed by identity for quite a long time. Remember that health tourism was a key argument of Brexit. You know, all of these European mothers coming here to give birth so that they can have British passports. That's not actually true, and so on and so forth. So that is a fairly old example. The idea of letting some people die is anguishingly, sometimes by age, sometimes by region, sometimes by ethnic group, is anguishingly present in the new right. There is an idea that, well, some people will die and it will be the weak. That's how races become strong. Yeah, and it doesn't matter how ethnically racist you are within the new right, whether you're a soft one like Johnson and you're a much more extreme one like Trump. There is an idea that, well, the weakest will die, particularly the old, and so on and so forth, which is also why some of their initial policies were in fact focusing on letting the disease rampage through society to achieve some immunity. A much more specific example of rationing healthcare by identity, if you're looking for one, is Salvini and Meloni, the leaders of the two ultranationalist parties in Italy, have been making a lot of scandal during the crisis because Italian hospitals were not asking for passports. and for residency cards. And they said, yes, you see in Milan in Lombardy, this is Salvini, whose party runs Lombardy, he claimed that in Lombardy, that's the Milan region, hospitals were overwhelmed because too many foreigners were going to them, and they should have asked for passports. I mean, hospitals were so overwhelmed that no one was asking for any paperwork. They were just trying to cope with things in Milan. So there have been claims that as foreigners are not asking for passports and policing healthcare that caused the crisis in Lombardy and northern Italy to start with. So this has been extremely politicized and will continue to be so. In fact, I think a lot of the social inequalities, the Saxena's question, inquires, are in fact also by identity, and we're going to cover up inefficiencies by blaming identity, like in Italy.
Great, thank you very much for those contributions. We've got quite a few questions coming in the Q&A, which is fantastic. I'm going to, so I will just ask the panel now, we'll do a few more questions and I'll ask him to kind of try and answer fairly succinctly so that we can get some more questions in. So I've got a question from Alvina Hoffman here, who was also one of the contributors to the video. And she says, thanks for your contributions. I'd like to ask a question on the political economy of care work and the unequal distribution of care work in society. Who's called back to work during COVID-19? How can we make visible the structures that distribute care so unequally? For instance, migrant workers flown in without any social distancing and forced migrant women taking care of rich women's children so they can break glass ceilings, etc. So I don't know if any one of you, of the panelists, would like to respond to that one. Or do I need to assign someone to discuss this question?
Well, let me say something about this. Who assigns the care work? Well, up until the onset of the pandemic, the care work was distributed by the market, as far as I can gather. You know, people would seek out jobs. Some people would seek out jobs with the NHS, and other people would seek out jobs in the care homes. So this was a kind of voluntary thing. But once the pandemic started, I agree with the question. I agree with Alvina. Once the pandemic started, there were shortages all over the place, and it wasn't at all clear how that recruitment took place. And I also have a strong suspicion that the recruits who were taken in were those very foreigners who during the Brexit campaigns were derided as sort of gate crashing our economy. So there are all sorts of unfairnesses there. When we need them, we use them, but in times of peace, we try and exclude them. So once again, my stress would be on this word unfairness, and how do we begin tackling whom would it be fair to employ in the care work sector? Is it fair to have quotas which say we'll employ people from some countries, not other countries, and so on? These are very, very big questions. And I think in the post-pandemic environment, they're going to become even bigger. But this is a somewhat empty remark because it's so general, but what I think is going to appear is that we will have to consider these questions in a global context. You can't just have each country deciding for itself. Because you will soon generate very extreme forms of conflict.
Great, thank you. Dushi, would you like to respond to this as well?
No, nothing further to add on that one, Leonie.
Oh. I cannot hear you, Dushi.
Sorry, I think my connection's a bit dodgy, but no, nothing further to add on that one.
Okay, fantastic. Pablo, short intervention? No?
I could address the next question, and that way we move on. Yeah,
that's a good idea. You address the next question.
Okay, so it's a question from our colleague Stefan. Hi, Stefan. Lovely to be here with you. he asks, do you see any lessons that can be learned from this pandemic and the national and international responses so far for other ongoing global crises, for instance, climate change or financial crises? There is one silver lining to this, one very, very big one. Coronavirus, from the perspective of dominant nationalist ideas in most powerful countries in the world right now, there is one huge lesson. This virus attacks all humans equally. It is biological proof that there is such a thing as humanity. And therefore, and this is important because nationalist ideas work on the basis of claims upon what biology does to us and what biology means to our politics. This virus is proof that there is humanity. And this is important because this can be the basis for a political drawback from these ideas. And therefore, as Stefan asks, it can be a thinking of coronavirus as a definer of our shared humanity, just like the plague in the Middle Ages, tuberculosis in the 1960s. It can itself be a roadmap, so to speak, to then learn to address other global crises and issues of global governance, climate change, the financial disaster that is going to follow this. I'm going to pass on to Mervyn that wants to continue.
Stefan, thanks for that question. I think it's a marvelous question. And my answer would be that during the course of the pandemic, there's been a learning process. I think all of us have learned, and most of the states have learned quite a lot. And if I could start mentioning a lesson, the first would be the scientific lesson, is the scientists have all been adamant that they can't do this alone. You know, the British can't do it alone. So there've been cooperations between Chinese, British, American, French, and so on, because there are huge international efforts to try and find a cure, to a vaccine to prevent further spread of the virus and so on. So my thought is that these forms of cooperation provide a model of how we might move forward in other domains. Now, another domain in which it has become apparent is in the realm of travel. So this pandemic travels, and it pays no attention to borders and walls, and especially very big walls. It simply crosses walls quite easily. So we have to then organize airline travel, railway travel, travel by boats and so on. And that takes international organization, because on the one hand, the idea of becoming perfectly autarkic and a country cutting itself off completely is not on, given the way the global economy is organized. And on the other hand, some kind of controls have to be put in place. So once again, we get international cooperation. So I think this is going to become the norm. This has given a boost to forces of what might be called globalization.
Great, thank you. Do you want to respond to this particular question? Otherwise, I have another question for you as well.
Yes, just briefly on this one. I think this is not just a healthcare crisis. It's affecting lots of other areas of citizens' lives as well. But I think what is also shown is that climate change is something that we thought, is something that's distant, that's far away. But what this virus has shown is that something very small can completely change the world, and we can very quickly adapt around it when we have to. So when we start using excuses like, oh, it's going to take too long, it's too expensive, I think what this pandemic has shown is actually that there are more urgent things that we do need to still address. And some of the consequences of not addressing something like climate change and destroying the environment is that we are going to probably see more and more this kind of issues coming up.
Great, thank you very much. There is another question here, and that speaks specifically to marginalized groups, which you spoke about. So I hope you can say something about that as well. It says many attempts of countries to achieve solidarity have led to some marginalized groups having their belief misrepresented or losing their abilities to practice certain liberties, e.g. Thailand, India. What are some mechanisms that can be used to achieve solidarity in culturally heterogeneous areas without amplifying pre-existing identity-based conflicts? Is that something you'd like to respond to, Dushi?
Sorry, was that for me? Yes, I think in countries such as Sri Lanka, as I've already flagged, the pandemic response has been discriminate towards some of the minority communities, and it's kind of flamed this sort of anti-foreigner sentiments that was already kind of very much prevalent in the country. And whilst the sort of social media and the sort of printed, papers, etc., whether there's a lot of censorship or self-censorship by these journalists, it becomes even more important for external solidarity to start supporting the people who can't speak within the country, and for these networks of greater solidarity either within the region or more globally with the diaspora, etc., start working together as one to support countries where we are seeing this increasing sort of militarization and securitization that seems to go unchecked at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. I don't know if Mervyn or Pablo want to respond to this question as well. No, okay. There's one specific question which I think is interesting. It's for Mervyn, but maybe the others can respond as well. Which is from Henry Redwood, and he asks, so Mervyn speaks about justice instead of, as a guiding principle, but justice seems to be equally vague. I mean, I'm paraphrasing now. So again, can we just say we need justice, or do we need to go further than that? So Mervyn, would you like to respond to that?
Thanks for the question, Henry. Of course, what you're asking for is a whole 2-volume work on normative theory. And I've got half a minute here, but my quick answer is that in Britain, for example, justice is, first of all, applying the law. The law includes all the laws pertaining to the implementation and the carrying out of democracy and regular free and fair elections and so on, and easy access to political parties, and avoiding any suggestion that the political process can be captured by an elite or by those with more money than others and so on. So the question of justice has to do with what are the institutional arrangements that we already have in place, both locally in Britain and internationally. And internationally at the moment, the institutions are, we have the system of states that accords to every state sovereignty. And when responding to this pandemic, we've got to make sure that sovereignty has been respected, that when we consider how in future to organize, that every state can have its say in the appropriate institution. And there are many of these, and most important probably is the United Nations and so on. So justice is not, as it were, pulled out of fresh air. It is built into the institutions we have, and we might start considering how to reform those institutions, but it would be piecemeal reform of existing institutions rather than some holus bolus reinventing of the world order. That's not possible, and that's just utopian thinking.
Leonie, you're on mute.
Sorry, I had muted myself. Sorry. No, I like Mervyn's going back to institutions here in terms of thinking about justice. I don't know if Pablo and Adushi want to say something very briefly about their understanding of justice, what that might mean.
Jesus, I mean, to be honest, anything but birth culture distribution of justice would be a very, very good beginning. I would like to address the questions I didn't see earlier from Charles. That says, when dealing with solidarity identified by nationality, there appears to be a conundrum between national identity based on passport as opposed to ethnicity or religion. This isn't a conundrum. Different types of nationalism define identity in different ways because birth culture, let me put it bluntly, birth culture is a lie. It is a claim upon biology. Yeah, and because it is nothing but a claim that says my biology designs me to do this and designs you to do that, yeah, then you can change that claim to make fit the identities that you have. If you're Modi, you can build an ethnic identity on the basis of a confessional one, i.e. you treat a religious community that has been long established, Muslims in India, as an ethnic community, i.e. a cultural one, but also as an ethnic community by giving it the attributes of birth culture. i.e. just like you would with dog breeds, you attribute certain political behaviors, X, Y, Z, you know, just like Trump says, they're rapists and they're drug dealers, the Mexicans, to their birth, to their biology. Yeah. So nationalism will treat identities as the hard divider of who deserves what, but that identity can be shaped in different ways. So for instance, the American identitarian right, they define themselves very loosely as Europeans. Yeah, all whites, basically. That's not the case for many identitarians in Europe who divide amongst themselves, right? You've got the Scandis and some Catholics and so on and so forth. So it's much more divisive. You can do it by religion, yeah? And you can do it by different ethnic groups. So for instance, Putin was tempted with, but ended up not working on an idea of reworking a Slavic identity. And he ended up going for a much more standard Russian one. Having said that, I have to go back to Mervin's earlier solution to this, I suppose, finding our shared humanity, and perhaps the silver lining that the virus forces us to see it if we want to.
Okay, great. Thank you. Dushi, did you want to add anything to this? I can't hear you at the moment.
No.
Okay, thank you. Right, so it's nearly 11 o'clock, and this is where we want to end. But there's a few more questions which I think are really interesting because they go in different directions, and they speak about some of which is partly been discussed around whether, you know, we can actually, this kind of common experience of threat can actually help us and create more solidarity. Others are actually asking, well, is that not going to make, you know, the focus on communal solidarity, is that not going to make things worse? And also questions about, you know, how can we actually create effective transnational solidarity as well. So if I could ask all three panelists just to give us a very short, very brief final reflection on the question of how can we create, in this kind of context, further transnational solidarities, and whether, you know, COVID-19 pandemic or sort of the other global shocks that we're going through at the moment can help us in that, or might be a barrier to that, or is it a lot more complex than that? So if you could each just give me a sentence on that, that would be fantastic. Mervyn, would you like to start?
Yes, I have a quick answer, and my quick answer is I think we should, in going forward, avoid emotional terms. In the time of this crisis, we use terms with a high emotional content like solidarity or care. Care is an affective term. You know, I care for my family and my children and my colleagues, but it's impossible for me to have the same affective care for everyone. So I'm very wary of going for these affective terms moving forward. Much better to have abstract terms like rights holder, citizens, the right of citizens to participate, and then the right of states to participate in the global debate about how to go forward. All the terms that Pablo so rightly has been terrifying us with, those are all highly emotional. And I grew up in South Africa when this was rampant.
Sorry, Mervyn, I'm going to cut you off. I'll ask for one sentence, but thank you very much. It's very interesting to come back to the question of rights and so on, but I'm interested to also think about here are there gender dimensions about thinking about what are abstract terms and what are emotional terms. But that will be another question, another discussion, I think, some other time. But I'd like to move on to Pablo and then Dushi to give a very short response to the question.
I think what I would say is that I think countries are tempted to think that they can deal with this on their own and become more nationalistic. But this is not, you know, I think globalization has gone too far for countries to deal with this on their own. And it does require, no matter what you want to call it, some level of collaboration or solidarity or understanding that we have shared vulnerability and it needs to be dealt together.
I would like to follow up. I would like to follow up with my final comment on the basis of Mervyn's one, because emotion also denotes, in my view, emotional words, like Mervyn rightly highlighted, denote normative power being thrown into the mix. Normative power is also about the subjective choice to choose who deserves what. Rights here are an important solution. That's why I mentioned the Florentine solution, the idea of earning your rights as a citizen. Because here is how you can get identity out of this equation. I think secondly, it'll be vital to remember our shared humanity, and that the virus proves it. And finally, I think there is a final comment to make, in that the virus has further shaken up a political context of political discourse that was already changing very, very, very rapidly. Nationalism has not erupted into the political scene like this for nearly 70 years in the West. And this crisis is changing it even further. We have a question that we didn't address on what has this done to traditional left-right generational lines. It has upset them completely. We've got nationalists doing welfare in Poland and in the UK, and left-wingers going right-wing economically in other places. This is also an opportunity for change, like all crises.
Great, thank you very much. So just on the question of emotion, which I think, yeah, this will require a whole, and rationalities will require a whole other discussion, I think, at some point. But I would also encourage you to have a look at the blog, the ICRR blog, where we have a series of contributions, and one of them actually is around emotions in IR that was published yesterday. So I will just quickly ask Maria whether she has any final comments or thoughts before I end it.
No, just thank you all for your participation, and special thanks to the panelists, of course. It's been really interesting to hear your reflection in this broader theme of the ethics of solidarity, community, and care.
Great, thank you. Yes, also want to thank all the panelists and everyone who's asked a question, as well as everyone who's contributed to the video. We'll be sharing the video via social media and so on as well. So if you have missed that first bit because it was muted, you can see it there. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating. And yeah, I hope we all get out of these crises rather in some sort of form of solidarity.
Thanks, Leonie. Thanks, Maria.